At 6:53 a.m., the USS Ward immediately sent a message to Naval Headquarters at Pearl Harbor. We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area. Most people think the attack on Pearl Harbor came from the air, but there's another story, one that appears only as a footnote in history books.
I stood on the side of the ship, the starboard side of the ship, and I watched it go right underneath the ship, right there below me when it was going down. And I had never seen anything like that before.
90% は帰ってこんじゃろうかいうぐらいな、そのぐらいな出ていく人もそれだけの覚悟をしとるしですね。それから私なんかもこれはまあちょっとしたら帰ってこれんじゃろうかいう思いをしておりましたけど。
One crew of sailors rose to become hero gods. One crew faded behind the horrific spectacle, the air attack on Pearl Harbor. Some people believe it never even happened. This is the story of the first shot fired in the Pacific War. In another hour, America would be launched into World War II.
People were starting to doubt that we had ever sunk that submarine, and we couldn't figure that out because we had lots of witnesses. We had a whole ship full of people on the Antares, the USS Antares. That was the ship that this submarine was going to follow into the harbor. They saw it. They saw what happened.
The Americans had trained for a submarine attack, but they never expected to encounter a midget sub in the waking hours of December 1941. And for 6 decades, the question remained: did the USS Ward sink the secret submarine? The answer to this question leads to other questions. Could Japan possibly have gained ultimate control over Southeast Asia? The damage inflicted upon the Pacific Fleet later that morning on December 7th shocked and humiliated the American military.
In the first 15 minutes of the attack, 40 torpedo planes make successful assaults on the battleships, and the main battle line of the Pacific Fleet's in shambles and ruins.
The Japanese believed that with the annihilation of the Pacific Fleet, America wouldn't be able to stop them from taking control of oil fields in Southeast Asia.
当時の状況から言って ABCD 方位陣ってアメリカ B がブリティッシュ D がダッチそれからC がチャイナねこれが日本をずっと取り囲んで息の根を止めようとするような作戦だということを往々にして聞いたことがあります。
The corner that Japan paints itself in is self-induced. Japan itself has the paintbrush. And now faced with that inevitability of not being able to negotiate with the West, it goes to war, and that strike will come at Pearl Harbor.
The conflict between Japan and the United States began when Japan invaded China in 1931. China and Southeast Asia became valuable conquests for oil and other exports that Japan depended upon for expanding their empire.
まあ、なんとしても当時アメリカがあれですね、崩鉄売らなくなったり、他のことを封鎖、経済封鎖をやってきましたね。みんなアメリカが悪いと思ってたんですよね。日本ではね。
And so with the Pacific Fleet moved out in 1940 to the Hawaiian Islands, it became inevitable for the Japanese that this was a threat. Now, for the United States, it was a warning to the Japanese that the American fleet could go anywhere. So I guess you can look at it two ways. For the United States, it was an intention of policy. To the Japanese, perhaps a dagger at its throat.
5 midget submarines were part of the attack plan, a plan that Americans could have been prepared for, but didn't believe would happen.
We saw the Japanese as inferior people. They wouldn't dare attack us. That kind of arrogance breeds that kind of result.
The midget submarines were Japan's top secret weapon, designed to sneak into the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor and attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The Japanese had high hopes of crippling U.S. aircraft carriers and battleships.
It was a foolhardy plan. It could have tipped the entire Pearl Harbor attack had they been discovered. And keep in mind, one of the submarines was discovered, And that incident, which took place with the USS Ward at about 6:30 in the morning, nearly an hour and a half before the attack actually unfolds, could have tipped the scales had they been able to identify that type of ship.
Japan's 5 midget submarines were unclamped and released from the decks of their mother subs off the coast of Oahu the night before the attack. Kichiji Daiwa's job on the mother sub E-16 was to help the midget submarine get ready for launching.
艦内からハンドルでバンド外して、それからそれが済んだらいよいよ何を発進、母船から離れるわけですね。離れるのは多少エアを放出して、それから水を少し出して、それから浮き上がるわけですね。浮き上がったらあとは自分でエンジンかけて走っていくわけです。
78 feet long, 6 feet wide, the midget submarines had a crew of 2 and carried a pair of 18-inch torpedoes that fired by compressed air. The submariners were confident in the superiority of their weapon.
The Pearl Harbor attack was the Japanese Navy's insistence on not just allowing the air attack to unfold, but in a way send the samurai in midget submarines in which 2 crew members were involved in 2 torpedoes to kind of move into Pearl Harbor under the cover of night and try to negotiate through the channel, lay low on the harbor bottom, and when the air raid begins, begin torpedoing ships.
The first warning of the impending attack force was at 6:40 a.m. A supply ship heading for the entrance to Pearl Harbor spotted a conning tower in the restricted defensive sea area. The Navy was short of men in 1941. 82 reservists from St. Paul, Minnesota, trained on the frigid waters of the Great Lakes. The young reservists were called to duty on a modernized World War I 4-stack destroyer based in San Diego. Pulled from 2 decades in mothballs, the USS Ward was now updated, fast and efficient, and bound for Pearl Harbor.
We got there, say, March, and it was in December when things started to happen, so we had the best duty in the world. We were in the Hawaiian Islands.
Commanding Officer Lieutenant William Outerbridge reported for duty aboard the USS Ward on December 5, 1941. It was his first command. His job was to patrol Pearl Harbor for submarines or anything else entering the restricted area. It was said that Pearl Harbor was submarine-proof. The 2 naval vessels would meet in the approaching hours of a typically beautiful Hawaiian morning.
The attack on Pearl Harbor officially was not a suicide mission. The midget submariners all said their prayers, wrote goodbye poems, said goodbye to their friends, boasted about how after they launched their submarines they were going to, strand their submarines near American ships and blow them up with the scuttling charge, go ashore and fight the Americans with their swords. Well, none of them got the chance to do that.
There were signs of intruders even before the sighting of the conning tower at 6:40 a.m. In the lifting darkness, the USS Condor, a patrolling minesweeper, spotted a wake that appeared to be made by a periscope. It was just 2 miles south of the entrance buoys to Pearl Harbor. The ensign on duty signaled the Ward. Outerbridge acted fast. He called General Quarters.
And then about an hour later, General Quarters again. That son of a gun is going to be a tough guy to get used to. A new skipper, and then he's pulling General Quarters drills like this twice. One at 3:30, another at 6 o'clock. Boy, are we going to get along with this guy or not?
It was still a quiet morning, touched by music and laughter left over from the night before. The submariners had every intention of interrupting the innocent moment.
No real living conditions on the midget submarines. They barely had time to turn around, much less spend any time there. It was stifling. There was no air movement. The air would get gassy with spilled acid from the batteries, the fumes from the machinery, their own sweat and fear down there. The air didn't circulate very well.
As the shadow of evening fell, the submariners prepared to embark on their attack mission, knowing they may not return.
完全に作戦に成功してくれることを願うとりますからね。どうしても それはひいき目になる言うたらおかしいかもしれませんが、まあそれが人情でしょうな、ひいき目に見るいうのがね。
In case of the midget submariners, they were determined to fulfill their orders and their mission, and as such, 5 of them were launched to do that.
These guys thought nothing of sacrificing themselves as long as it helped Japan. I mean, everything else was secondary to them.
Harsh discipline at the Naval Academy at Itajima taught cadets absolute obedience to their superiors. 95% of applicants failed to make the cut. They went through physical and mental training so rigorous that they lost nearly all sense of self.
襲撃はまず夜間の強水道通過、狭い水道入っていく通過ですね。そういうことを一生懸命やりましたね。だから訓練中に、座礁したりした船もありました。それからさらに、訓練が進んでいったら今度はまあ港湾にはまず必ず防線網が張ってある。その防線網をいかにしてくぐり抜けるかいう訓練ですね。
Well, the military philosophies of the country were it's different in night and day. I mean, you had a absolute allegiance to the emperor, that the greatest thing a soldier or sailor could do is die for the emperor.
You have to be careful. You can't talk when these people are that radical and that willing to give their own lives to get at you, you cannot talk them out of anything. That's when you have to take action. And you have to be more prepared than they are.
For the most part, Americans didn't understand the Japanese, and the Japanese didn't understand Americans.
If you look at coverage of things of that period, they often refer to the Japanese as little. They refer to them as midgets. Their weapons were toys. But midget submarine is essentially a racial slur.
The Japanese also believed in a pure society. I mean, they didn't believe in any intermarriage. They saw other Asians as lower class, such as Koreans and Chinese. So there was also an arrogance of racism among the Japanese society.
The submariners pressed on. They had only one chance each to fire the deadly torpedoes. But as they inched their way to the entrance of the harbor in the wake of the supply ship USS Antares, they were discovered. It seems likely that the crew of the stealth submarine may have been unaware of the danger looming behind them.
We went to general quarters and manned the guns, but then the surprising thing was they ordered to load the guns with live ammunition. Now, we hadn't done that before.
In a moment he couldn't take back, Outerbridge made the command. He knew this was an intrusion into protected waters. He just didn't know if it was by the U.S. or an outsider. The sub had no markings. Outerbridge had the Ward bearing down on the midget submarine at 20 knots.
First he thought, maybe I'll ram it, the sub. Instead of firing on it, maybe I'll ram it. But then he thought differently, because he had just taken command the 5th of December, and that was his first command. And he thought, if I ram it, maybe I'll damage my ship. And so he thought, no, I'm not going to ram it, I'm going to fire at it.
His instructions were clear, open fire. He did, and then he messaged ashore that they had fired on something inside the defensive sea area that certainly looked like a submarine.
When Outerbridge called in the report to headquarters, we have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area, their response was, confirm.
And then we've realized that, hey, this guy is pretty sharp to call general quarters, and the reason he called it was not a drill, it was for the real thing.
The message went unheeded as a warning.
Everyone we would talk to, as I was growing up and that, and I said, yeah, I was on the Ward, and we sunk a Japanese submarine an hour and 20 minutes before the attack. And, well, what do you mean you sunk it? Have you got any proof? Well, no, we don't have any proof, but I know I saw it going down.
For more than 60 years, proof lay at the bottom of the ocean. Ironically, the USS Ward shared the same fate as the Japanese sub exactly 3 years later. On December 7, 1944, converted to a troop transport, the Ward was attacked by a kamikaze pilot in the Philippine Sea. The same man who gave the order to fire upon the submarine gave the order to sink the burning ship. The crew became like family under Outerbridge's command.
It was just like a father to us afterwards. And we got so we would do anything for Admiral Outerbridge, but we would call him Captain, and he'd say, "You don't call me Captain, you call me Bill."
But that's not the end of the story. Terry Kirby led the University of Hawaii Undersea Research Team in the Pisces 4 and Pisces 5 deep-sea submersibles. He trained pilots and tested new technologies and advances in side-scan imaging used to map the ocean floor. Kirby first learned of the sub in 1972 from the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. After watching the scene between the Ward and the mini-sub, he was inspired, and in 1991, he set out to find the truth in the story. On an ocean floor littered with military debris, the researchers found everything from cables to coffee cups, rocks the size of buildings, and sunken ships. Always on Kirby's mind was the possibility of finding the Japanese mini-sub. Kirby and his crew of researchers had a pretty good idea of where the sub had landed. Kirby was amazed by the sub's flawless condition after more than 60 years, and sobered by what he knew of the submariners who remain inside.
Sitting there looking at the submarine, I opened up my book and I looked at those young faces, and looking at that submarine sitting right in front of me really connected me with that day, and it also connected me with the Ward's crew. And the most rewarding thing for all of us as a crew with Hurl was what it meant to that crew, because they're all reservists. They're not really given credit for what they've done. It was never verified.
There can only be one first shot in any war. Now it's confirmed.
It was not only confirmation that the event happened exactly the way they said, it made the entire war real to a whole new generation of people.
It's clear that there are many lessons learned.
I guess the one lesson of Pearl Harbor was that by the United States being unprepared to receive the attack and the disastrous results of loss of life, ships and aircraft, was something that left an indelible scar on this country.
The Pearl Harbor's motto is, be prepared, keep America safe. And that's what you have to do. I think what happens an awful lot of times is right after the war, we start de-arming and everything goes to pot as far as the military is concerned. And then we're really just opening the door again for any aggressor that might have ideas.
Although the ship is gone, a piece still remains. The USS Ward's No. 3 gun now sits on the lawn of the Capitol in St. Paul, Minnesota, where veterans of the ship gather each year to remember the sacrifices made by brave men on both sides of the war. Relatives of submariners came to Hawaii to ceremoniously toss sake and chrysanthemums on the graves of their loved ones. After more than 60 years, the search for their lost sons in war was over.
We had a Japanese named Kichidawa who was brought over from Japan with the National Geographic. We got to do a lot of talking, and he said that was my job. I had a job, I was in the Navy, he was on a submarine. He was on a submarine that brought one of the mini subs over. They brought him over piggyback. So he had a job to do, and he says, and you had a job to do. And I said, that's right. I said, I joined the Navy when I was just a kid and 17 years old, and I said, you joined when you were young. And so we both had our own job to do. And he said, and we did our job, and now we can be friends.
いや、それはね、ワードの人はワードの人で任務を完全に達成されてるわけなのでね、その結果について憎しみはもうありませんね。 あなたは立派に任務達成されましたねと、お互いネイビーとして心の通ずるものがあるはずなんじゃからね、私は祝福しますよと、そういう言い方しましたね、ハワイ行った時でも。思いよ、こんにちは。
Hello, my friend. May this note find you in good health and happy. I enjoyed being with you on the ship in Hawaii in November of 2000. Enclosed are some pictures of you taken on the ship at that time. I have extra copies that I have kept for myself. I went back to Pearl Harbor and went down in a 3-man sub to see the small sub that we had sunk on December 7th, 1941. Really was a thrill to see it. Take care, my friend, and may you have good health. Your friend, Will Lehner.